My name is Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa. I'm an Afro Puerto Rican novelist and memoirist, and I am so glad to be spending a little time with you.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from and grew up, and what was your childhood like?
Okay, well, I was born in Carolina, Puerto Rico. I came here at age 2. My mother, we moved into El Barrio, to a no-fashion tenement building with the bathroom out in the hallway and the tub in the kitchen, and it was quite a new experience for all of us. We were on 104th Street and 2nd Avenue, and all those buildings, of course, are gone now. And then we moved up to the Bronx, to the Crotona Park area. My parents were looking for a calmer environment, and they felt like we don't have a front yard, but we have Crotona Park. It was a nice time, but it was a transitional time in the Bronx. And when that neighborhood started going downhill, we moved to another part of the Bronx. And then when that started going downhill, by this time it was I was in middle school, and my parents had saved up enough money to buy a house. And in the meantime, during those middle school years, things got really bad in our neighborhood. A man was killed in our building, and the blood was there for like a week. The super was drunk, and he never bothered to come and fix it. And my mother, who was a nurse, knew what to do, so she called up the health department and reported him. So we were kind of persona non grata. So we were sent to Puerto Rico to live with my grandparents while they saved up money to get a house. And so we were in Puerto Rico for 2 years, in rural Puerto Rico, in rural Carolina. And that was a whole different world also, you know. Dealing with chickens and lagartos and, you know, outhouses and all of that. And that part of my life was very rich, and a lot of my writing comes from those 2 years of listening to women on the porch in their rockers talking about everything in their world.
So, was it around that time that you decided to become an author, or was it later on that you had like an aha moment?
I decided to become a writer much later, although I always loved writing. When I was in high school, well, my parents were very protective, so we weren't really let out of the apartment. So my whole world was a television. But the television didn't reflect me or any of the people I knew or my community. And I complained and complained and complained. And when I got to college, I was an English major, English and Spanish. And I was complaining, and I was introduced to B.D. Thomas down these mean streets. And I said, But that wasn't quite it either, because he had a very street life when he was very streetwise, and his books were full of life in El Barrio, which at the time was also changing and becoming violent and drug infested and stuff. So that also didn't portray my reality. So someone finally said, why don't you just stop bitching about it and write your own book? You're an English major, you're not going to be happy with anybody else's version of your life, so you might as well write it yourself. And I thought, And that's really the first time I started thinking of my life as being worthy of putting it on a page. I wake up in the morning, I write longhand in my journal, and I usually have like a special pen. This one is my Cleopatra pen. And I sit and I write longhand, and then later on I transfer it onto the computer. But sometimes I don't know what I'm writing, and it doesn't matter that I don't know. Eventually I'll know. Eventually I'll find out.
So what are your biggest influences or inspirations?
Other writers Um, when I read Toni Morrison, it was like, I can write about spirits. I can write about magic. When I read Isabel Allende, it's like, oh, I can write about my grandfather who's with me in spirit even though he's not here physically. I can write about difficult times in our lives and still project the humanity of the people who are living through that time period. I also felt like when I was in Puerto Rico that the Afro Puerto Rican culture was all around me in reality, but not on the page. So it was the same thing that was happening here. And so I had this idea of, at the time there wasn't even a term Afro-Boricua or Afro-Puerto Rican, but I knew that in our music the stories were there, and in our lives the stories were there. And I started collecting the stories. At one point I was very sick, and I went to Puerto Rico to stay with my grandmother because I had nobody to really help me here. And she threw out my medicine and she said, vamos a buscarte unos teses y vamos a hacer unos remedios. And she and her friends made teas for me and baños for me, and all her friends who were in their 80s at the time would come and tell me stories about what Puerto Rico was like during World War II, and how the uniforms that the Americans brought for Puerto Rican soldiers were too big because our men were smaller than the American men, and how one of the ladies was a seamstress and she worked for the Army, tailoring the uniforms so that they would fit our men. And my grandmother talked about the hurricane, San Ciriaco, San Cipriano, whatever it was, and what it felt like to see the men go out every day to look for cadavers.
Oh, wow.
And what toll that took on my grandfather, looking for his neighbors who weren't there and finding them miles away, or parts of them, or another story that I heard was about a woman whose husband was being unfaithful to her, and she couldn't catch him at it or anything. So one day she just got up on a horse and started riding around the neighborhood until she found his horse, and she had su escopeta, and she had a rifle. And she said, okay, this is going to end one way or the other. Now, which way is it going to end? And that was the end of that affair. And so it was these stories were very different than the stereotypical stories about Latina women who were powerless and victims and unable to do for themselves. I found that the women in my family were stronger than the men in many ways. They gave them their props, but it's like, sí, pero esto es lo que vamos a hacer. No. So I wanted to show that.
Yeah, who's the real
right.
Boss.
Right.
How has your craft developed over the years?
That's a good question. When I started, I had no idea what I was doing. I was writing down what stories people told me. I thought I was going to write memoir, the story of our people. But then I found that for every person, there were 3 different stories. The same incident, but seen through so many different eyes. And so if I included someone and I wrote what I thought, it was, no pasó así. Or if I didn't include, like my mother, I didn't include her because we were so close, I didn't think I could be impartial. And her reaction was, well, am I worth so little that you're not including me in the book? And at that point I decided, oh, okay, I'm a novelist. I write fiction, and that's it. That's it. It's fiction. Which was great because it gave me an opportunity to explore. My favorite work of my own is a piece that hasn't been published yet. It's called A Woman of Endurance. It's the novel that I am about to send to an agent and hopefully will get published. And it's about an Afro Puerto Rican woman who is purchased as a breeder, and her babies are taken away from her as soon as they're born and sold on the auction block. And I wanted to know, how does this woman survive being serially raped and then having her babies taken away as soon as they're born? I love telling stories. I think of myself as a storyteller. I dislike having to make it a business, having to deal with marketing and all the rest of it, and contracts, and having, when with Daughters of the Stone, the publisher wanted to know where to put it, under Latino lit or under African American lit. I said, well, you didn't read the book. The whole point is that I'm both black and Puerto Rican, so it belongs in both. Better yet, put it under literature. I said, people will never find it. And I thought, oh, so that's what they think, that this isn't literature.
Speaking of Daughters of the Stone, that is your book that's been published.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I was so naive. I tried to get the whole story of the Puerto Rican people together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote a book about 150 years of our history, starting in West Africa, moving to Puerto Rico, and then moving to New York City. It's like, now I think of it, and it's like, oh my God, what gave me the nerve to think I could do all of that? But God takes care of children and fools. So it's a book about 5 generations of women in one family, starting with capture in West Africa, going through the colonial period in Puerto Rico, and then coming to urban America. So it goes from about mid-1900s to the Vietnam War. I have been in a number of anthologies. Here's one right here called Abriendo Camino, and it is an anthology of Puerto Rican women writers in New York City from 1980 to 2012. And I was really pleased to be included in this anthology. And there are others. People can go to my website at Dahlma Llanos-Figueroa.com and have a whole list of them. Some of my publications are young adult stories. For example, there's a story called Hair Inspection, about what happened in a gym class when they decided they were going to check our hair for lice. And the notion that was a very simple thing for a white gym teacher who washes her hair every day and comes to school. But then that didn't take into consideration that it would be hours of washing and drying and pressing my hair and curling my hair. And so they had no concept of what a black child would have to go through to satisfy that supposedly simple request. So that's a memoir piece that I wrote about an experience I had as a teenager.
So what advice would you give for an aspiring writer?
Write from your heart. Write your truth. Because if it's your truth, it is automatically somebody else's truth too. I think that when we write truth, we write a universal story. We all hurt. We all celebrate. We all love. We are all jealous, whether we admit it or not. We all want the best for our kids. And I think that supersedes the differences.
thank you so much for inviting me into your creative space and sharing your thoughts and your work.
Thank you so much for asking.